Why is it illegal to advertise pharmaceutical drugs in most countries?
It's illegal to advertise pharmaceutical drugs in most countries because most countries are smart. What I mean by that is it's only New Zealand and the United States, believe it or not, two countries that allow pharmaceutical firms to advertise their drugs directly to the public. And it didn't exist in the United States until 1997. So for a long time, even in the US, which is very pharma friendly in terms of politicians and big corporate companies, even here, we thought it was a crazy idea for a long time. And then finally, it got through the FDA that, oh, maybe it will be helpful, in fact, to pass along information directly to the consumer instead of just passing it to the doctor. Of course, I don't know how anybody would have thought at the FDA that drug companies were going to pass along and spending tens of millions of dollars in advertisements information to the consumer as opposed to just propaganda. So what we get when we turn on the television or wherever else are drug ads that are meant to sort of give you the idea that they're going to change your world and be cure-alls. And then there's a list of side effects at the end, which we hear that are rattled off so fast that we almost become immune to them. We don't listen to them almost anymore. And it's become a powerful tool for the US drug companies to make sure that consumers, the patients, go in to doctors and ask for the newest and latest drug. Remember, the biggest overhang of this, why do they want to advertise to consumers? It's an odd business because drug companies don't sell directly to us, the patients. They have to sell through the middlemen. The middlemen in this case are doctors. So they have to convince doctors to write prescriptions for the patients. And as a result, they want patients to demand from the doctors the newest products. That's why we get the advertisement. Most of the world is smart enough not to allow that. It's a bad idea when they passed in 97. It's a bad idea today.
After writing a book on pharma, do you see them as heroes who are saving our lives, or an industry that is overpromising benefits and understating side effects of their products?
Okay, so I think the subtitle of my book will tell you something about the conclusions, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America. I've tried to do what I view as a balanced history of the American drug industry from the time that it started in the era of morphine and heroin being legal by Bayer, sort of patent remedies and what I call the cocaine cowboy days of the drug industry, no rules, no prescriptions, nothing else required, until we got through the more modern eras of the 1950s and antibiotics and FDA regulation. The thing is that it's like any other industry. If I was doing, let's say, the defense industry or tech or lawyers, I'd find some good operators and some bad operators. The problem is when it comes to drugs, they're affecting our lives in a very different way. They're providing medications that may in fact be helpful or may in fact be injuring us over a period of time. So when you say, are there heroes? There are some people that have over time done some great work inside the laboratories and come up with some real discoveries and haven't been greedy about the proceeds from them. So for instance, when the very first polio vaccine came around, Jonas Salk, who was the inventor of that, was asked in a radio interview, who owns the patent? Who owns it? You? The drug company? Who? And he says, nobody. Could you patent the sun? It's one of the chapter titles of my book, meaning nobody owns it. This is a drug that should be used by everybody. We're giving it away, essentially. That's unusual because most of the time it's all about how much money's made. And that's the second part of the equation. If I find occasionally some people who are doing the right thing inside the labs, trying to do the right thing, where the wrong thing is done is inside the boardrooms, where greed often takes control. And there are too many instances in the drug industry's history in which drugs are found to have bad side effects. The drug companies then go ahead and hide those side effects for decades at a time, leading to injuries and loss of life in instances. And then they eventually get caught. They pay a fine. That's the cost of doing business for them. And so there's a real damage. We're in the middle of an opioid crisis still that's claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. So we know very well what the downside is from prescription drugs. We live in a country, in America, where Americans take 75% of all of the world's drugs. That's an amazing number. Are we healthier for it? I don't think so necessarily. So the long answer to your question, do I find them as heroes? I find some people that I admire that were chasing penicillin discoveries and items like that. And we're doing research on AIDS and HIV and others, but I also find a tremendous amount of greed and villains when it comes to how they have served the American public over the decades.
How did the pharma industry make money on the COVID crisis?
COVID's been a golden egg for them in many ways, and that's not to say that they're not sitting around a boardroom saying we want COVID, we want the next pandemic. But the minute the pandemic takes place, they're sitting around the boardroom saying, okay, what do we do to make sure that there's multi-billion-dollar revenue lines coming in? And there are two different things for that. There are therapeutics to treat it, and we see no better example. I wrote about this early on. Gilead, a small company on the West Coast, had a drug called remdesivir. Remdesivir originally was developed for what they hoped would have been an aid for HIV, or they thought even for Ebola. It was useless. It was never any help. It was funded by the federal government, about $75 million of taxpayer money going through the NIH, some private funding for it. So all of a sudden, Gilead takes that drug, remdesivir, and they say, we think it might be useful against COVID because it is an antiviral. That's what they were testing it for. Turns out that this useless drug on their shelf that was paid for by the taxpayer does show some effectiveness against COVID. It might save 4 to 5 days in a hospital stay. So Gilead then says, we want to license this drug under a special provision of the government's law called orphan drugs. We'll be able to price it at a much higher price. That they were stopped from doing. But still, they priced it at about $2,200 for a full treatment around the world, except in the United States, where they priced it at $3,300, a third higher. Why? Because they can. The drug companies have unfettered pricing power when it comes to the US. So remdesivir is just one example. There are billions of dollars in terms of therapeutics, and of course, there are the vaccines. Billions of dollars in terms of revenue for Pfizer, for Johnson & Johnson, for Moderna. And not only are they bringing in the money now, because they haven't given this away, they haven't shared the research, this isn't free, they're charging for it everywhere, but they are building in what I call a stream of revenue for the future. Because what do we hear about the vaccines? Oh, this isn't like polio, one shot and you're out. This isn't like measles, 2 shots and it's finished. This is going to be recurring shots. It's going to be a bit like the influenza shot. So you need a booster shot for a new variant, maybe in a year or 9 months. We don't know how long it will last. So we'll be talking about COVID vaccines for years to come, billions of dollars in revenue for the drug companies. COVID has been very, very productive for them.
Tell us the story of the Posner family, Purdue, their $600 million fine, more about the opioid crisis and the bankruptcy court.
So I think that actually is the Sackler family. Posner is me, and I'm the person who have been investigating it. But Steve there, I think, was thinking he got his families mixed up. But the Sackler family, which is, some people may have heard of the Sackler family. If you've followed at all the opioid crisis, you'll know it. They are the private owners of a company called Purdue Pharma. Purdue's blockbuster, it was a one drug hit company. You know, you hear about one band hits. They had one band hit and it was on the charts for a year, and then we never hear of that band again. That's almost Purdue. Their hit blockbuster was called OxyContin, came out in '96, and through 2018, the last year for which there are full numbers, sold about $35 billion in sales, much of it by sort of what I call mismarketing and fraudulent marketing and deceptive marketing by the company, marketing for everything from backaches to things that it never was really approved for by the FDA, lax oversight by the FDA, all types of greed from the distributors in this, the big drug distributors like Cardinal and AmerisourceBergen, problems with the chain pharmacies like Walgreens and others who are encouraging their pharmacists to write more prescriptions for it. So there are all types of people to blame. But the Sackler family in particular, the owners of Purdue, became billionaires from this. And they were put on the Forbes richest families list in 2015, estimated to be worth $14 billion. Almost all of it from OxyContin. I do, in my book, I cover the Sacklers actually from the early 60s, because it turns out a Senate investigation had called them a Sackler empire decades ago. But that's because they had made an antibiotic the number one selling drug in America by marketing. They made Valium the number one selling drug in America for 15 years. It held that title. So they were in the drug business doing things in terms of marketing aggressively to Americans years before they had their addictive painkiller in terms of OxyContin. But the trail of devastation and death left by them is astonishing. And now Purdue, the company, has filed bankruptcy protection. The Sacklers aren't bankrupt, but they're trying to contribute several $billions to an overall settlement. If they're able to do that, they will walk away from this entire process without any other lawsuits, with no criminal prosecution. They'll still have billions of dollars. And that, unfortunately, is one of the saddest and worst stories in the history of American drug industry.
What has been the response from Pharma about your book?
I don't think anybody in a pharmaceutical firm boardroom has been jumping up and down for joy at the publication of this book, for two reasons. They tried to ignore it for the most part, but there's also no question this was a difficult book for them to deal with, because I try, as I say, to not only be even-handed to the extent you can, but I'm very, very hard and critical of them in the long run. But in addition, the book is 750 pages long, but 250 pages are source notes. So if somebody looks at it at Merck or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson, says, we don't like that book, and they don't like what I say about them in a particular paragraph, they get to go back and see what it's from. And it's not a secondhand piece of information. I'm going back to original sources here. I'm going back to their own company documents that have been produced in lawsuits. I went through literally hundreds of those lawsuits. I had freedom of information files that filled up 15 different file cabinets inside our small apartment in Miami. We had trouble walking through at one point to get to the kitchen. And so I build up what I call a documentary case. And this documentary case is not one that they like. I also had something I noticed that was interesting. This is my 13th book. Trisha is also an author. My wife, she's done 2. In those 15 books in the last 40 years, I've been on a lot of national shows. Some of them, often I get to go on again when I have a new book out. But this time, I didn't get any of the Sunday morning programs. I didn't get CBS This Morning. I didn't get the Today Show. I didn't get the evening news and some of the cable programs. And why? Very interesting footnote I put in the book about them. 70% of the revenue from their advertisements come from drug companies. You look at many of those news shows that appeal to an older audience, those from 55 and up, and they are advertising all the time, everything from erectile dysfunction to menopause, to new cancer treatments. And so it goes down the line. They don't necessarily want somebody else on the program telling you how greedy and terrible these very firms are that are paying the bills of those shows. So that was unfortunate. I think I did get a little bit of a boycott, but it was very, very what I call subtly done. Nobody, did a tweet from Pfizer that said, "Don't put them on."
What categories are the biggest money makers for the pharmaceutical industry?
Without any doubt, the biggest money makers are the drugs you have to take every day. So that's what they're looking for. There are categories of drugs called orphan drugs, and those are really for rare neurological diseases. They're very expensive and they're very profitable for the companies. But if you're talking what I call bread and butter drugs, the drugs that they're looking for to develop, they want to develop something for what they call chronic diseases. So they don't like antibiotics because you don't take them for that long. You take antibiotics for 7 days or 5 days or 3 days, and then that's the end of the treatment. And in addition, if you develop a new antibiotic today, you spend all the money on developing it. The doctors are not supposed to give you or dispense the latest and newest antibiotic because they're worried about antibiotic resistance, because they had prescribed so many antibiotics since the 1950s and on for everything from sniffles to a cough to a cold when there was no need for it, that we've created this amazing resistance. They put it into our food supply. They have it in terms of what comes out to us from animals and from farming products. All that antibiotics has meant resistance. You come out with a new antibiotic, you don't want to prescribe it right away. So drug companies say, so why should we spend the money coming out with a new antibiotic that's given for only 5 or 7 days or maybe 3 days, and it's not even prescribed that often? And instead, let's develop drugs for diabetes. Let's develop drugs for heart disease. Let's develop drugs for cholesterol and high cholesterol, and make sure that those are the drugs that go out all the time. Let's put out drugs for a whole growing list of psychiatric features, because every time there's a new, what is, sort of Bible for the psychiatric industry of what diseases are, new ones are added in on what's called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. So now we have PTSD that can be treated. Now we have anxiety disorder that can be treated, clinical depression that obviously can be treated, variations of bipolar disease. Those are pills you have to take every day for the rest of your life. They love those types of pills.
Are clinical trials done carefully and scientifically and with no bias? Is it true that a pharmaceutical company can do 10 clinical trials for a drug and only report on one of them and ignore the other 9 if they didn't like the results of that trial?
It's it's really remarkable to me. One of the great untold stories, it's told but doesn't get enough attention, is how the average person, if you ask them about clinical trials and they hear that a drug has passed 3 clinical trials, they think that's really the stamp of approval, that it means it's safe, it's proven it doesn't have side effects, and that the FDA has been on top of it. And it doesn't mean that at all. As a matter of fact, it's remarkable that drug companies are able to conduct their own tests and then hold them back, as a matter of fact, if they don't like the results, and go ahead and submit only the ones that they want. And this happens time and time again. I repeatedly go through instances inside the book in which this has happened. And just last week, as a matter of fact, here we are in February of now, we're talking of 2021. It continues to come out. There are new cases. The state of Hawaii, the Attorney General had sued Bristol Myers Squibb and Sanofi, the French company, for the marketing of their blockbuster drug Plavix. It's sort of a blood thinner. It's brought in $50 billion in revenue to Bristol Myers over the years, and another $20 billion in revenue to the French company that was their partner. And what did they do? We now know from this lawsuit, they were fined $865 million. They had a study in the very beginning when the drug was approved in 1998 that showed that the drug was not assimilated as well by non-Caucasians, so by East Asians, by Asians, by anybody from China, by Black, by African Americans, by Blacks in Africa. They didn't get the full benefit of the drug. So what does that mean? Not only was the drug likely wasted on them, but in addition, they might have had a higher incidence of heart attacks and strokes over the years, the very thing the drug is supposed to stop. Every time in the next 10 years, 12 years that came up as an issue inside the company, their internal emails show that they said, oh, we don't want to go there. We don't want to do that research because we know what it might show. The FDA eventually forced them to put it on their label in 2010. Guess why? Not because they did the research, but because independent researchers without any tie to the drug companies were doing it around the world. So this is amazing to me that we're in a situation in which the drug companies, who should have an obligation legally, which they don't, morally, which they pay no attention to disclose information that they know about when it may be that their drug is causing an injury to one or more people out there or to tens of thousands of people. It gets pushed under the rug. And then what happens? They pay a fine, $1 billion fine, a $5 billion fine, in this case, $865 million. And you know what it is? It's the cost of doing business. They have made so much money from the profit of these drugs over time that they're willing to pay that fine, and they still are not dissatisfied with it. Nobody goes to prison. You never hear about prison sentences. I never see perp walks with big pharma executives, very, very seldom. And maybe if we saw more of them, there might be a difference. But until that happens, you're going to continue to see this play out.
Do doctors get the scientific information about drugs?
So on the recent decision in Hawaii, the Attorney General getting a judgment of nearly $1 billion against Bristol Myers Squibb for not marketing correctly and holding back the key information about how their drug might affect tens of millions of people. I tried to place that story and an editorial about it at the New York Times, at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal, went along to the Boston Globe and the Chicago Tribune, and nobody was interested. They have run stories about it in Bloomberg Law, and they've had stories about it in Reuters, but you won't read about it in the mainstream press because the figure, $865 million, isn't viewed as blockbuster enough. It's not $10 billion. The drug is Plavix. It's a little bit off the radar for a lot of people. It's not something that everybody can relate to. And that's the problem. I realized when I recently went through this, if the mainstream media takes a story like this, which is almost $1 billion fine for this type of injury, and says, oh, that's interesting, but it sounds the same as everything else we've heard in the past, that's the problem. It does sound like what we've heard in the past because this is what happens. This is the modus operandi inside the pharmaceutical industry. They do things that are wrong. They put people's lives at risk sometimes. They hide the information. Then they get caught. Then they pay a fine. And the mainstream press is so accustomed to it, they don't cover it, not because they're part of a conspiracy, not because somebody calls them up and says, don't do it. They're afraid they're not going to get enough clicks on their website or enough people reading it because it sounds too similar. That's really a bad stage we're at if that's the case.
Do doctors get the scientific information about drugs directly from the drug company? And is this a problem?
There's no question that the fact that the pharmaceutical companies supply the scientific information to the doctors is a major problem for two reasons. I discuss inside the book where back in the 1960s, some of the people marketing drugs at that time, when there was a much smaller number of drugs on the market, they realized that doctors in their practices were getting overwhelmed with the amount of information they had. So you were doing a family practice as a physician, and there were literally 400 new drugs approved in the previous year. You're getting information and you're getting salespeople coming in, so-called detail teams trying to sell you the drugs, drug representatives. And what happens is you can't process all of it. So you can't read all of the scholarly information on it. So you go instead by what the drug companies tell you are the highlights. You have to believe their promotion. You have to believe their sales from their drug reps. And some of the drug companies actually thought that there was a benefit to what they called the confusion factor. And it literally comes in from one of their memos. The fact that the doctors were so overwhelmed with information, they wouldn't be able to do their independent research. And so what you get today is you find that doctors are increasingly specialized. So you'll have a doctor who's looking only at one specific area as an internist. Somebody else is just doing neurology. Somebody else is just following diabetes. They know their specific area, but then they don't know outside of that. Yet what happens? You get an internist, let's say, who's a specialist on their cardiovascular doctor, and yet they happen to be prescribing in their practice 30% of their prescriptions may in fact be for psychological reasons, may in fact be for depression, things they know nothing about because they have patients coming to them for heart disease and then saying, by the way, doctor, I'm a little depressed. The doctor says, well, why don't we give you Xanax? Why don't we give you, a new SSRI that's out or a new antipsychotic, without knowing much more than what the drug company has told them. So this is, I think, in the end, incredibly dangerous. The people who are supposed to be the guardians of our health, the physicians, because they are supposed to weed through what's oversell from the pharmaceutical companies, aren't doing that.
Do doctors get incentivized to prescribe more of a certain drug, and is this a problem?
So if it's not bad enough that doctors are overwhelmed by the amount of information that they have, and they have trouble picking through it to pick out the right information from the bad information, it's even worse that we allow doctors to get paid by drug companies. So there's a whole host of ways. It was Arthur Sackler, the patriarch of the Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, who came up with the idea back for Pfizer when they were marketing an antibiotic in the late 50s. Why don't we develop a speakers bureau? Why don't we come out and send salespeople out? A speakers bureau is a great idea. So you have a drug that comes out, it's for new heart disease, or it's for diabetes or cholesterol. And then you go to a group of doctors who are your highest prescribing doctors, not necessarily the best and the brightest, the ones who are prescribing the biggest amount of those drugs. And you say, why don't you become part of our speakers bureau here at Pfizer? We'll pay you $10,000 and you're living up in New York City. So in the middle of February, we'll send you down to Bermuda. That's a pretty good deal. And we'll have a group of 100 other doctors down there in Bermuda, and you can get paid $10,000 to give a talk and just tell them what your experience is like dispensing this drug. This is easy money, and it's too easy money because it happens time and time again. It happened in the opioid crisis. Some of the key opinion leaders in the medical field became on the Speakers Bureau for Purdue Pharma and got tens of thousands of dollars. They get consulting fees. They're paid as expert witnesses sometimes to go to trial. They're taken out for dinners. Now, what is the FDA's response to this? The FDA and Congress said, after years of tolerating this and allowing this to be the case, oh, okay, maybe we should disclose how much drug companies pay to doctors. So we will put this up on a website and you'll be able to find out how much is paid. Now, how many times have all the people listening to this now who are into their health and into finding out information have gone ahead and checked those types of website information? Very, very little. You know why? It's not on the front page. You can't find it right away. It's not like doing a Google search. You have to hunt for it because nobody wants to make it that easy to find. And as a result, they pay them through backdoor ways as well. There are plenty of incentives, financial and otherwise, the publication of articles inside major, medical review journals, all types of ways that they get some payback from the drug companies. And that's really unfortunate. It's not viewed as a conflict of interest because we trust doctors to be able to take that money or those benefits and still do the best thing. But human nature comes involved. And that's why you end up on the opioid crisis, with so-called pill mills, in which doctors are really running a clinic as a legalized drug pusher, sending out patient after patient, writing prescriptions for opioids around the clock, whether you need them or not, at the maximum amount. And eventually many of them get arrested, but not all.
How many pharmaceutical drugs have been released in the last 50 years? And how many pharmaceutical drugs that were approved turned out to not be safe or needed to be recalled?
I don't know how many drugs have been released in the last 50 years. I know how many drugs are approved by the FDA today for currently there are 20,000. It's an astonishing figure. People are stunned at that when they hear it, because we think of only the handful of drugs that get the headlines, the big money drugs and everything else. We forget how many variations of different drugs there are, how many generic drugs there are, how many drugs there are that don't get the big headlines. They're small earners, but 20,000 drugs today. So we're talking many times that, if you think of the number of drugs approved over time. And how many have caused problems? Hundreds of those drugs. And here's the important part to remember. I believe you can't really say, okay, this is the number of drugs that have been approved, and this is the number of drugs that have caused problems, because the drugs that cause problems can be life-changing. They can be fatal in many instances, and they differ on how they affect people. So thalidomide was a drug not approved in the US, but in the 50s when it was approved in Europe, it was over-the-counter, a drug meant to treat women who were nauseous and having difficult morning sickness during pregnancies, and turned out to be the worst possible birth defects that came around. What was the effect of hormone replacement therapy? I talk about this in the book that was approved in 1960, really came out by Cyril. So here was a hormone that was supposed to replace what women were losing, estrogen, they thought, from menopause. And a doctor, Robert Wilson, writes a book called Feminine Forever, in which he says, by the way, if you don't want to become a sexual eunuch, you don't want to become withered and dried up and old, you should take estrogen from Wyeth, because it's a wonder drug. It will restore your vitality, your skin, your hair, your sexual vigor. Nobody knows at that time that he's paid by Wyeth to write the book. It becomes a national bestseller. He's subsidized by Wyeth in his office. And it takes 10 years for the public to realize in congressional hearings that Wyeth had much too much estrogen in its original pills. So the women developed breast cancer and blood clots at an alarming rate. And when that information was coming into the company, they hid the information instead of making it public. And the same thing happens with the birth control pill marketed by Cyril, the first birth control pill in 1960. 15 years of reports coming into the company about blood clots and problems with cancers from women, because the levels of the hormones in those pills were off the charts. And when this finally disclosed and brought to task, they come up with a reformulated version and pay a big fine. So when we say how many drugs have caused problems over the years, it's tough to quantify it, tough to say how many lives have been affected. But I know this, that in those instances in which drug companies had the early information, hid that information, kept it away from the public, lives were destroyed and ruined in many instances, not just for the person who took the drug and ended up with the side effect or ended up dying, but for the families of those who survived, the walking wounded. I deal with them all the time in the opioid crisis. Mothers and fathers who have lost a son or daughter to opioids because it was over-marketed. A person who lost their job or lost their marriage, or estranged from their children because of what happened. So the family effects, beyond just the drug effects to one individual, they're wide and far-reaching.
Does the FDA, CDC, Health and Human Services, or any other government agency own patents on any drugs?
Yeah, so it used to be the government didn't own any patents on drugs. All we did from the federal government was give away taxpayer money to drug companies so they could own the patents and make the money. Now, that sounds kind of crazy, but true. So from the 1930s on through today, the NIH has given over $900 billion in grants, much of which has been used by drug companies to then develop drugs that they patented and made money for, with nothing coming back to the federal government. That always seemed crazy to me. So the solution was, not my solution, but the solution the government came up with is in 1980, Birch Bayh, one of the senators, and Bob Dole came up with this act that said, okay, if you have federal funding behind it, you can get a patent on this. So the NIH and the doctors behind it can file a patent. Many of them have. Thousands of patents have been done. It's supposed to return some money to the federal government. They're supposed to split it with private industry. Some of the individuals hold it and then they leave government. It hasn't cleaned up the process. All it's done is the problem isn't who holds the patent, in my view. It's the patent itself. It's the idea that you can lock up exclusive rights to a drug for 17 years, 15 years, 12 years, depending on the length of time. We have the longest patents in America of any country, not surprising. In 1960 to 62, Estes Coauthor, who was the crusading Tennessee senator who went after the mafia, he investigated the drug industry. And one of the things he came up with is our patents are much too long. We should make them 5 years or 7 years, and we should force the patent holders to license the drug after 3 years to everybody who wants to come in at a fair right. You think that got anywhere? Not at all. The drug industry went and chopped that apart. So we have these incredibly long patents. With small variations on the drug, they are able to get a new patent. Sometimes I literally have a chapter called One Atom of Difference, in which in the 1950s, they took a very successful antibiotic and the new company changed one atom. It made no difference in the therapy of the drug, made no difference in how it was dispensed, but it qualified to get a patent before the US Patent Office. And there are other instances in which not only do they use products of nature, penicillin and antibiotics, to get patents on this, but they are able to manipulate the patent to hold it for longer than the patent term. So for instance, Eli Lilly held the patent on insulin for nearly 40 years, even though the patent was for only 15, because they changed it just enough to get a new patent and an extension. This happens repeatedly. So the question isn't, does the federal government get the right to hold the patent? The question, I think, is why is the patent system so abused? And why does it work to the benefit of very expensive prices for exclusive drugs for so long instead of generic drugs at an earlier time?
What is the most expensive drug?
Well, Novartis has put out, I think, what will be the most expensive drug. It's just a year ago, in 2020, it's a patent drug that will treat one of the rare neurological diseases. It's priced at $4 million a year. They were originally thinking of $2 million, then they came in at $4 million. They are able to show this very interesting on patent drugs, which are the most expensive drugs in the world. In the 1980s, the US government recognized there was a problem. Pharmaceutical companies were not treating these rare neurological diseases and genetic diseases because the patient populations were very small, might affect only 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 people. So what the government did is they passed a law that for what they call this Orphan Drug Act, and said to the drug companies, come on, we'll incentivize you. We'll give you tax credits. We'll give you breaks. We'll give you a special 7-year patent extension. You'll get a fast process going through the whole thing. You have all types of things to be able to do. The European countries said, okay, if you come up with a crazy price for a drug, $1 million, $1.5 million, you're going to have to prove to us that we, because we have national health, we, the government, pay for health, that what we pay you for that drug is going to save us money over treating the person for that same illness over time. So if Novartis wants to charge $4 million, it has to go into the UK and the United Kingdom and prove to the National Health Service that the National Health Service might have paid $5 million for that very same individual over the period of treatment, and they're going to save $1 million. So the drugs sound incredibly expensive, and they are. Novartis even has a pay-as-you-go plan for governments to be able to pay them in installments over 4 times to show you how expensive it is. And the real question is the extent to which this has been gamed and abused. So the idea of orphan drugs sounded wonderful in the beginning because you're going to treat these small patient populations. And then since then, what has happened is drugs that were originally approved as orphan drugs have been made into general interest drugs, and none of the money that was originally given to them as incentives comes back. Best example of that is Allergan. They had a product called Botox. Botox was originally used as an orphan drug to help this sort of eye problem in which you had a twitching in the eye and it wasn't controllable. The same thing with the throat. Orphan drug funding gets it approved. Eventually it's used for cosmetic purposes and is used widely and becomes one of the most successful multi-billion-dollar drugs. Once it becomes that, you would think that Allergan might be under some obligation under the law to give back some of the incentive it got for the original development of an orphan drug. It doesn't give back anything to the taxpayer. And there are other instances in which individuals or companies get approval for orphan drugs at exorbitant prices, and then just when the patent is about to expire, they slice a new part of the market off. So they say, okay, we have this approved. Okay, now we're going to make it for pediatric use only. So we'll make it just for children. Now it gets a new patent and a whole new series of income for years to come. It's unfortunately abused and gamed, and nobody's doing anything to fill that in Washington or in Congress or the FDA.
What actions would you take if you were the head of the FDA and had full authority to fix the medical and pharmaceutical industry?
It's a great question. I've thought many times, what could I do if I had the magic wand to run what was happening at the FDA? And that's the sad answer is there's no magic wand. So if anybody thinks there's one answer, by the way, oh, let's do X, Y, and Z, and we'll have nirvana, it's not going to happen. There are plenty of areas for improvement. So I could tell you along the way how I would close the loopholes, for instance, in orphan drugs, how I would close the loopholes, for instance, on what I call controlled substances and what's happened, how I would make pharmaceutical companies supply. You do a test, a clinical test for your drug beforehand. You're going to have to submit it to us. We want to see it. You can't hold back on the information and cherry pick what you want. We want to see it all. I would make it an obligation, a criminal duty if they violated it, as they got information that received a critical mass on what I call adverse effects and reports of adverse effects. They couldn't decide not to disclose it to the FDA. They have to turn it over. Let me tell you, though, one of the biggest problems with all those rule changes, the FDA is outmanned, outstaffed, and outgunned at every stage by the drug industry. The FDA is supposed to do the tests on all the foreign production laboratories that make generic drugs. China makes about 90% of the generic drugs together with India that come in. The FDA is supposed to send representatives over there and examine those laboratories. They haven't even been doing that under COVID. They're already stressed on even examining by random the laboratories and tests that they're supposed to do in the United States, much less abroad. They don't have the staff to compete with what the drug companies do. So the drug companies come in for an application for a new drug and they paper them to death. They send in literally tens of thousands of sheets of paper. They hire law firms and consultants. They send it all in at once. If something's in there that might raise somebody's eyebrows, buried in underneath 20 different reams of paper, and the FDA doesn't have the staff to be able to go through each drug application in the same way. In addition, one last thing. The FDA has made a process where you can get a faster review of your drug. And guess what that's allowed for? Not because the drug is important, not because it's a life-saving drug, not because we need it tomorrow, but because you pay more for it. So if a drug company pays an additional fee, it gets an expedited basis. And as a result, it rushes through. The FDA has even less chance to pay attention to all the details of it. It gets it approved for more. But since it's helping to fund the FDA budget, they like those drugs. And that's a conflict that shouldn't exist. One last thing. I would stop tomorrow the revolving door that allows FDA officials to leave the government and go to work for the companies that they were regulating and approving. No better example than the opioid crisis. The FDA official, Dr. Wright, Curtis Wright, who approved OxyContin with all types of questionable things in 1996, guess where he went to work? He goes to Purdue Pharma. His assistant who worked at FDA goes to work for Purdue Pharma. The people who created the orphan drug laws, they went into their own consulting firm to work for Pharma to show them how to game the system and get orphan drugs through. That should stop. And let me give one example of what I think is wrong at the FDA, a prime example. The Biden administration recently appointed an acting chief of the FDA, Janet Woodcock, and they need somebody at the helm of the FDA that's good because they need a veteran, somebody experienced. She's been there for over 25 years, and they want somebody to run that agency well with COVID going on and everything else. I just wrote an editorial in USA Today a couple of weeks ago about why she should not be nominated as the permanent head of the FDA, even though she has a lot of supporters. She allowed the opioid crisis to play out under her watch for 25 years. She was the chief cop, in essence, at the FDA at the time when these approvals in Purdue came back time and time again and didn't get regulated and got things on the label that allowed it to continue to grow. There are opioid victims who believe that she's one of the primary reasons the opioid crisis is as large as it is. But guess who likes her? The pharmaceutical industry. She's viewed as industry friendly. So they're pushing her nomination. And I tell you that I think that this is a test. There are some very good people that also are on the short list for the FDA commissioner. They're not going to solve the agency overnight. But I would be very disappointed if this administration ends up putting Janet Woodcock in as the permanent nomination to run the agency, because her history is such that she should be disqualified. And I say that time and time again. She's competent, she knows what she's done, but she's also industry friendly, and she has problems in the opioid history. She should not be running the FDA, and we'll see what happens under this administration.
Which pharmaceutical drugs have caused the most unintended health problems, side effects, or deaths?
Well, no question that the most lethal drug prescription epidemic in history is the opioid crisis, because it's been allowed to fester for so long, for so many years, and we have hundreds of thousands dead. There are also instances, remember with the opioid crisis, you're dealing with an addictive product, so that when it was difficult for people who became addicted to OxyContin or one of the fentanyl products to get their drugs through doctors, as the FDA started to make it a little bit more difficult to refill those prescriptions. Where did they go? They went to the street. They bought fentanyl products on the street. They went to heroin in some instances, because OxyContin is chemically very, very similar to heroin. So, you then pushed part of what I call the legal prescription problem into the illegal market as well, and mixed it all together. But there's no doubts that over time, there's been a trail of deaths caused by bad drugs. Everything, from hormone replacement to what we talked about with the pill before, and even things. There was a moment, for instance, in the swine flu epidemic of 1976. What I have a chapter on it. I call it the epidemic that wasn't an epidemic. They thought there was a swine flu outbreak at Fort Dix, New Jersey. It turned out there wasn't. But what did Gerald Ford and the government do? They said, swine flu, that's the same thing that hit in 1917, 18. Let's inoculate the entire country. So they got 4 pharmaceutical companies to go ahead and make the vaccine. When those 4 companies, including Merck and Pfizer and others, had 100 million vaccines, the government said, give us the vaccines. The 4 companies said, oh, not so fast. We want to build into this agreement we have with you a reasonable profit and immunity from all liability for any side effects. The government gave them both of that. And guess what the side effects were when we talk about what happens? It was a thing called Guillain-Barré, which is a neurological syndrome, a rare one. Thousands of people came down with it after 40 million people got the vaccine. So those lives were ruined, and then the lives of those families ruined. I don't like to get into a situation where I say, here are the number of people who fell sick from adverse effects, the number of people who had long-term debilitating effects, or the number of people that died. Because if it happened to you, even if it was 1 out of a million, it's ruined your life. And there are too many instances of that in the pharmaceutical industry history.
Does the pharmaceutical industry have liability for their products, or do they not have liability?
The drug industry does have liability for their products, and the reason I say but, there shouldn't be a but here, because we think they're held responsible for the things that they do wrong. But they're held responsible almost invariably by paying a fine. And that is difficult, because I've never seen a situation in which the drug companies were held to pay a fine larger than the amount of money that they earned on the drug. Even in the case of the Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, OxyContin, they will walk away with billions of dollars of money earned from OxyContin sales after they have settled all the lawsuits and any threat of criminal liability. They will still walk away with profits no matter how much they pay. And that's the case time and time again. So remember, these are companies that do $500 billion a year in business, the top 10 companies. Nobody's putting them out of business by levying a fine against them. So they are liable, but they aren't liable to the extent that they're stopping their bad actions. They repeat it time and time again.
Are the medical journals accurate, science-based sources of information, or is their information influenced by the pharmaceutical industry?
So the medical journals, from the Journal of the American Medical Association to Lancet to other top medical journals around the globe, they are prone to often having articles filled that are sponsored by drug companies. So, at the end of the article, it says these 3 researchers have the following ties, but they're able to hide those sort of what I call sponsors to the studies from the full disclosure. So we end up too many times with pharmaceutical friendly studies that end up in the medical journals. And guess what? This will be a surprise to no one. If you take a study in the last 20 years, roughly in the last 20 years, of studies that were sponsored by drug companies, about 85% of them tend to be favorable. 85 to 90% are favorable. The results are good. low side effects and wonderful drug effects. If you take the ones that aren't sponsored by the drug companies themselves, it falls under 50%. About 40% of those tend to be relatively good drugs, and almost 2/3 have problems. It's not just a coincidence. Clearly, the studies that are sponsored that work their way into the process of the medical journals are a problem. And for those of us in the lay world who are trying to decipher which ones are real and which ones might have a slant or a bias to them, it's almost impossible to do. One of the things that I have in the book is that in the early 1960s, the head of the FDA's antibiotic research division was being paid by the Sackler brothers to run a group of magazines that they had, medical journals, and edit them. And it turned out that he was being paid for the number of reprints that were published of those journals. So he was earning a couple of $100,000 a year when that was earning $1 million a year. And he forgot to tell the FDA about all that money. When they find out, they made him step down. He didn't go to jail. He just had to give up his position. So this goes back 60 years ago, and it's still happening today.
Do medical school students learn a curriculum based on the best science or based on information coming from the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, it's a mix of both, and it depends upon the medical school that you go to. So very interesting that you would think that at medical school, you're only learning the latest science, but you have to step back and think, okay, what does that mean? Because there are pharmaceutical companies that make big donations to medical schools. Tufts University, Tufts Medical School was named after the Sackler family, had a Sackler School of Medicine. Now, it wasn't just because the Sacklers wanted their name up in 5-foot granite letters. They had that also in the Metropolitan Museum and a number of other prestigious places, including the Smithsonian. They wanted up on Tufts because Purdue was able to get a course curriculum that was very friendly to the dispensing of painkillers, and that they really weren't that addictive, and explaining to medical students how they could be used in a whole range of situations. So it's not as though the students at a medical school get a stamp that on their course says Pfizer approved, Johnson & Johnson approved, Sackler approved. It's worked into a curriculum based upon the amount of money that's maybe been donated already to the school, and becomes friendlier to the drugs that are under discussion and the way that the teachers approach it to the medical students. I know that from talking to students who graduated from medical school in the 1980s, they tell me to a person, men and women who are doctors, that they went to school at a time when they were told opioids were very small chance of addiction, 1 to 2%, and they should be widely dispensed for pain. You talk to somebody graduating from medical school in the last 10 years, and they really don't dispense opioids for the most part, even if you've had your wisdom teeth pulled and want to give you a Tylenol instead. So there's a problem in getting a drug, painkiller if you really need it. So you've gone from one extreme to the other. What's taught in medical schools matter. It's how doctors approach dispensing medications when they get out.
Which drugs do you think are true miracle drugs that have saved lives?
I think that if I was going to pick the top 10 list, but the top of my list, I think it's one of the most important drug discoveries ever, is penicillin. Before penicillin, and forget for a second what we know today about antibiotic resistance, if you can. Block from your mind the overuse of antibiotics, which I talk about in everything from, on the growth of vegetables to animal stock to across the field. When it's first developed, discovered in the late 20s, then an Oxford team puts it together, and finally the US government has this crash program on it during World War II. It saves a lot of lives. People beforehand who got an infection, you cut yourself with you're out pruning a rose. This is literally how it was tested. You cut yourself with a thorn, and unfortunately you're unlucky and it becomes infected and then becomes blood poisoning. You could die from it. Penicillin stopped those easy types of things. It stopped the ravaging of gonorrhea and syphilis and sexual disease. It led to all types of mental disease and a host of other illnesses. It stopped people dying on the battlefield during World War II who got a wound that would have killed them beforehand because that would have been infectious. So in terms of how it changed the narrative for the drug industry, it made the modern drug industry in many ways. And it became the most important single drug as what I call a change for us as patients. And then there are a lot of problems with it. Insulin, also a very important drug, changed the life for diabetes patients who in other cases would have often had amputations and the loss of limbs. Some targeted cancer treatments in the last 20 years have helped people with some rare genetic forms of cancer, but the field has been slow in coming to deal with that. But there are some important drug discoveries, none more so than penicillin if you take a snapshot in World War II.
Is the medical industry trying to eliminate alternatives to their drugs, such as chiropractors, herbalists, naturopaths, homeopathics, herbalism, nutrition, and other natural approaches?
No question about that. I mean, you think that drug industry doesn't just compete with itself. Of course, Pfizer's competing with Johnson and Johnson. They're competing with Merck. I get that. But they're also competing with what they would view as alternative treatments, complementary treatments. At 1900 in this country, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, there was a real choice between allopathic medicine, going the route of what the AMA would eventually become, and naturopaths and homeopathic medications. That was crushed. The AMA became a good lobbying force to make sure that doctors got licensed and doctors became the only ones to go to. And then they got a monopoly eventually. Remember, no prescriptions are required. For a long time, you didn't need a prescription to buy controlled substances. They weren't controlled. But in 1938, they required the first prescriptions. They don't really require prescriptions across the board until the late 50s. And then it's in league with the doctors. So the doctors have the AMA. They've got the lock on what you should get as traditional medical treatment. Now they're pushing aside all the naturopaths, chiropractors, everything else out. And then now you have the drug industry saying, okay, now you get you need a prescription to get a drug that might save your life. And who can prescribe it? Only doctors. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that's why you'll see in the medical literature and in the drug literature, they will criticize, talk about the lack of effectiveness of acupuncture, of different therapies, of touch therapies, and that's because they'll say, "Oh, it doesn't have the gold standard. It hasn't had a clinical trial in which it's a blind placebo test." But I will tell you that what they do, and this is time and time again, by closing the door to those and putting the emphasis just on pharmaceuticals, they have made a country, in our case in America, too dependent on pharmaceutical drugs, too dependent on reaching for a bottle right away, and critically, too much in a rush for a fast solution. And what I mean by that is, acupuncture, for instance, which I've had acupuncture before, can be quite useful. My wife's had acupuncture, but you don't go to an acupuncturist once for an hour and you walk out and say, "Oh, I'm healed. My shoulder is better. I'm completely balanced. My sugar levels are better." It takes time. It's a series of things. The same with a chiropractor. And so what the pharmaceutical industry has said to us, "Oh, that's too much work. Don't worry about that. It's unproven. And even if it worked, by the way, why do you want to spend all those weeks or months doing that? We have a solution. One pill. You pop one pill a day and you're healed." Now, of course, that's a lie. We know that. You pop one pill a day, you may be worse off in some instances. But that's the promise of what they've done. And in a day and age in which people want fast solutions, they've made an easy solution. So my wife wrote years ago a book called "This Is Not Your Mother's Menopause." It was about her natural passage through menopause, how she didn't take HRT. She has a history of breast cancer in the family. So she put together a package that worked for herself with black cohosh to treat hot flashes and a whole series of things that worked naturally. It may not work for everybody, but it's a lot of work. She has to exercise. She had to do things. A lot of people would look at that and say, "No, I'd rather take HRT. Give me the hormone replacement therapy." So if you're lazy, Big Pharma might be great for you. But if you want to do a little bit of work, there are alternatives that can work.
Is pharma getting better results than 25 years ago due to all the new technology we have?
Pharma has certainly made advances in terms of biotechnology. You hear about these small biotech firms and what they are able to do. So if depends on how you define progress, but I mean, the drug industry would certainly define progress as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines out. I know a lot of people are nervous about the vaccines. A lot of people don't like the fact that they are a synthetic vaccine, a messenger RNA. But it used to be a vaccine was either a live vaccine, had a little bit of the actual underlying, illness you were trying to treat, and that happened with polio. It was a Sabin's vaccine, which was given to millions of kids. I was a kid at the time in the 60s. The little sugar cube had a little bit of the live polio vaccine. And as a result, some children, a small number, develop polio from it. They knew when they were giving the vaccine that that would happen. It's impossible to give a live vaccine and not have a small number of people actually develop the disease who may be susceptible to it. So that happened. So therefore, for the most part, they went to dead viruses, so-called inert ones that wouldn't be. And that's what the flu vaccine is. You get the vaccine or the influenza shot once a year. It doesn't have a live virus. It's not supposed to make you sick since the virus is dead. Now you get to the new, what I call the modern age, 2020, 2021. You have vaccines that go into your body, delivered in a little capsule that essentially tell your body genetically to wake up and develop a defense for something it's never seen before, this T cell that's going to come in from the COVID virus, and be prepared for it. People worry about, is it targeted enough that it's only turning on that defense to the T cell, or can have a chain reaction for other changes in your body? We may find that out in years to come, but that's the technology that has allowed pharma to develop new vaccines, targeted delivery for some genetic forms of diseases and cancer. I think we will see in the future, far down the road, that scientists may be able to say that certain people with this genetic 23andMe, we go to 23andMe to find out about our genetic heritage, and it says you're prone to this disease or that disease. Mm-hmm. Some women can find out if they're more prone to breast cancer if they have a BRCA gene or other genes. If you're prone to those diseases, they may have treatments that are specifically helpful to those people with a genetic predisposition. That's going to be very specialized medicine, and in the beginning will be very expensive medicine. So it won't be available to everyone. It won't be available to the poor. It won't be available to developing nations. But down the road, it could be helpful.
What is a pharmacy benefit manager? What do they do? And is this good for the public?
So pharmacy benefit manager, you hear that word and you say, huh? Most people will say, what? And I can tell you right off the bat, is it good for the public? No. So the idea of benefit, no, it doesn't exist. What it is, it's benefit for themselves. I found this out. There's a chapter on it. I was absolutely stunned to realize how this became the case. Why do we in the United States pay the highest drug prices in the world? Part because we're the only country in the world. We're one of two who allow drug companies to advertise to consumers. We're the only drug country in the world that allowed them to set their own prices without any negotiation, unfettered pricing. And in the 1980s, when insurance became bigger and bigger, and drug companies were coming up with formularies to say, these are on our list of drugs that are approved, we'll pay for these drugs. A group of companies came together, PCS and others, some developed by drug companies themselves, that said, we'll process the paperwork. We'll go ahead and take the paperwork from the insurance companies and process it, sort of like payroll processing for companies. And they became known as pharmacy benefit managers. Well, over time, those pharmacy benefit managers had the ability to actually make the formulary list up. And they decide which drugs are going to be on and which ones are going to be covered. And guess what? They aren't required by law, because they aren't regulated, to go ahead and pick the best drugs. They aren't required to pick the cheapest drugs. They're required to pick the drugs they want. And sometimes the drug companies give them rebates to pick their drug, and they aren't required by law to disclose those rebates to anybody. So we are dealing with a middle person here in the drug distribution process only in America that is literally worth billions of dollars. And the pharmacy benefit manager companies like Caremark and others are multi-billion-dollar companies that are earning money off of being the middle person, and all they do is their profits come from extra prices paid by us in the end, the patients. It's a terrible story that just needs reform and isn't being reformed.
Is there a different price if I pay cash instead of insurance for a drug at the drugstore?
So it's hard to imagine that you could have insurance. We pay a lot of money for drug insurance most of the time to be part of us. Even people who are in Medicare, 65 and over, have to usually have a separate policy for drug coverage. So you would think that if you're being insulted by having to pay for drug coverage, you probably at least would have the benefit of getting the best price when you go into pharmacy, and that's not always the case. So what happens is, hard to imagine that you could go in and your drug policy may require you to pay a $20 or $30 copay for a particular drug. You may have a drug that you take out for cholesterol. That a pharmacist will say that'll be a $30 drug pay. You've saved $550 today. Otherwise, you would have had to pay that. Well, if you actually came in with no insurance at all and said, what's the cash price? Sometimes it's less than your copay. No, that's hard to imagine, but true. And the best part of this is pharmacy benefit managers were able to make it the case in all 50 states. It's now slowly being whittled away that it was against the law for the pharmacist to tell you as the patient that there was a cheaper price if you paid cash. They only had to tell you if you asked. So if you said as an informed consumer, by the way, I'm filling this prescription under my insurance, my copay is $20. Is it cheaper if I pay the cash price? The pharmacist then had to tell you, yes, it's only $8. But if you didn't ask, the pharmacist wouldn't tell you. And that is how drug pricing in America is made at the detriment of us, consumers, patients, those given prescriptions, and the benefit of those who are reaping the profits in the distribution process and in the pharmaceutical companies.
So are the insurance companies for or against the higher drug prices?
The insurance companies cover some of the higher drug prices. They are for making money, as everybody is in the process. And so if they lose money on drugs, then they don't like it. So let's assume that there's a very, very expensive drug, and it's $200,000 a year for a genetic illness, and you have that genetic illness, and they go ahead and cover that. That's on their formulary. They're going to have to pay for that. So they work that out, and they assume that they're going to make money instead by charging 4 million people who need just a generic antibiotic, $4 an antibiotic, when it really is costing them 10 cents. And that somehow balances out. They occasionally get it wrong, but for the most part, they are not covering expensive drugs because they have the spirit of Gandhi or Mother Teresa. They aren't doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They have calculated that they have to cover it in some instances because they're being forced to by the government, but they are covering the minimum they want. And when you hear about the process of being required to make sure that it's medically necessary, this is a process where drug companies, insurance companies often push you off of the name brands and try to get you to take a generic as early as possible because they don't want to pay the extra money.
How did Valium become so popular?
Valium became so popular because it was the marketing genius of Arthur Sackler, who's the patriarch of the Sackler family. He opened up an advertising firm for drug companies. And we say advertising firm, this is in the late 50s. So he wasn't advertising to consumers, but he was advertising to consumers because Sackler was diabolically a genius when it came to marketing. So he went to, Hoffman LaRoche went to him and said, you just made an antibiotic, the number one selling drug in America, and it had no difference from its competitors in terms of its structure. We have a new drug. They had Librium out first. And he decided to make Librium the number one drug in America, which he did for 3 years. It's the first of the benzodiazepines. Then it's succeeded 3 years later by Valium, which he makes the number one drug in America for 15 years. And how does he do it? He makes it part of the American consciousness. He puts it into articles. He has people write about it. He prepared packaged articles that would be sent out to editors, at journalists, at new health columns, and said, here's a new wonder drug. They would write about Valium in Time magazine, in Newsweek, and others. He would run a 4-page color spread in the middle of National Geographic or Life magazine. Those magazines would be sent free to doctors' offices at a time when they had waiting rooms. He would sit in the waiting room. And then the FTC would come to him at one point and say, by the way, you're running ads inside a consumer magazine for this drug. You're not supposed to be advertising to the public. And Sackler actually went before the Senate and said, oh, by the way, we only intend those ads to be for doctors. And they're perforated edges along the edge of the insert in the magazine. So doctors are supposed to pull them out before they put it out in their waiting room. Of course, that never happened. So he was a master at getting around the rules. He put it into everything from what I call Valium's ladies clubs to, the idea of what we call pills around the country. He popularized Valium and made it think as though it was what he called an everyday pill. A pill that you could take if you didn't have that many problems. It had no downside. You wouldn't become addicted to it. It didn't have any long-term effects. It would make you feel a little bit better about the stress of dealing with life. And he marketed it to women so that they wouldn't be neurotic and hysterical, as he called it, because that's how he viewed it. And he marketed it to men because they were the breadwinners, so they wouldn't get ulcers when they went to work and brought home the money. And today we look at that type of advertising strategy and say, how sexist, how was it possible that he could have done it? But it worked. And it took 15 years to find out that Valium and all the benzodiazepines were in fact very addictive, that they caused a whole host of series, that they were difficult to get off of, that they caused problems with individuals, they caused liver problems and kidney problems and depression. And by that time, Hoffman LaRoche had made literally more money from Valium than any company had ever made in the world at that point.
How else did pharmaceutical companies focus on women to increase sales of their drugs?
The so the pharmaceutical companies had marketed. They had an experiment that was done at Walter Reed Hospital, at taxpayer expense in the 50s, called the Executive Monkey Experiments. And they took two monkeys. They strapped them into a machinery, and they were only able to move their arms. And they would deliver electric shock to each of the monkeys. Then they put a lever next to one of the monkeys, and if that monkey operated the lever, it would stop the shock to both of them. Monkeys are pretty smart, learned to operate that lever pretty quickly. They did this experiment hundreds of times. They would do autopsies of the monkeys after each time, and they found out that the monkey who operated the lever, the so-called executive monkey, the one that had to make the decision, had arterial cirrhosis, had ulcers, had all types of problems with the organs and aging of the body inside. The non-executive monkey, the one that didn't have to operate the lever, didn't have those issues. So pharmaceutical company took those to be women and men. So that therefore the men who had to operate the lever, they were the ones who had to look strong for society, go out in the 1960s and be breadwinners. They were the ones who needed drugs in order to operate better, be able to bring the money home and never show that they were under any stress. Women who weren't operating the lever, their main problem was they were never going to come down with ulcers, but you needed them just so that they would be able to work better. What does this mean? Ritalin, which is a stimulant, was advertising to women in the 1960s, showing them with a vacuum cleaner, doing more vacuuming faster. Valium was running ads where they showed a 35-year-old girl who had not found, a 35-year-old woman who had not found a husband, and said 35, single and neurotic, and explained why she needed Valium to make her feel better about her life. And all of the images that were sold to doctors as scientific information about men was that those very same drugs would make them stronger in going out and being able to do what they had to do in terms of society. Pharma marketed hormone replacement to women for beauty, for the vanity of look better and you'll be safer with this drug. So even in those instances, they played to what I view as the sexist marketing, which worked always to the disadvantage of women. The marketing to women of pharmaceuticals in the 1960s and 1970s is one of the most distressing parts of the American drug industry, in my view. Doesn't mean there's not subtle, subconscious marketing that takes place today, but it was overt then, and it worked in many cases.
How big is the medical industry, and what percent of the United States economy do they make up?
So it's almost impossible to just take a slice and say, okay, here's how much of the US economy or the gross domestic product is medical industry, because it's not just pharmaceuticals, which are big, $1 trillion, but it's also medical devices, thousands of medical devices. It's the number of visits through doctors. It's imaging labs that do all the MRIs and the X-rays that are done. It's the hospices that provide care for cancer care and others that are part of that long extended thing. There are hospitals and clinics. So if you put it all together, it's a significant portion of the US economy and a growing one as well. So that what I find is, you look at it here, we pay more in the United States, not only for prescriptions, we use more prescriptions than anybody else, we pay more per prescription, but we also pay more for medical care, and we aren't necessarily healthier. Pharmaceutical companies like to say, oh, in the US, people they have a lower incidence of heart disease, they die of a lower incidence of heart disease and cancer compared to their European counterparts in England, France, and Germany, because they use more drugs. There's no evidence that that's the actual reason why, but the difference is very, very small. All I know is that compared to the European countries, we use a much higher percentage of drugs, and we aren't necessarily any healthier for it.
Are you done writing about pharma, or do you think you'll write about it again?
I've always said in the past, 13 books and none of the books are related. So the book before this was about a history of finances in the Vatican. I've done books on political assassinations and done books on Nazi war criminals and 9/11. So normally, whatever I've written about last, the next book, I don't know what it is usually not about the last subject, but I am still tied to pharma in some ways. I'm still working on it. I just did that editorial about Janet Woodcock and why I don't think she should be the FDA commissioner. I did 3 editorials last year in the New York Times since the publication, 2 of them about the Sackler family in Purdue and how they might get away with billions of dollars in profits from OxyContin, one about how the drug companies themselves were roadblocks and obstacles to the development of a vaccine on COVID. So, and another one in Newsweek, I wrote about how some of the companies who have been developing so-called treatments for COVID use the rumors of those treatments to make millions of dollars for the executives by selling stock at inflated prices once the rumors hit. So there's plenty to do in the world of pharma. I don't know if my next book will be on it, but it's a tougher one for me to break away from, because we all have a moment at which we go to a doctor and there's some condition or something's come up and they want to prescribe something to us. And then we have to decide whether we want to take it or not take it. It's what I call the pill syndrome. It comes into our lives if you live long enough. And as a result, this topic affects all of our lives in a way that some of the other subjects I've done did not.
You mentioned antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. Are we on the verge of completely losing antibiotics due to antibiotic resistance? And is that situation getting worse?
No question, antibiotic resistance is a major problem. As a matter of fact, the first chapter in my book is called Patient Zero, and that's a woman who was hospitalized in 2016 in Reno, Nevada, with what should have been a bacterial infection that should have been cured by antibiotics. And they gave her every antibiotic they had in that hospital, and nothing worked. And then they alerted the CDC, who sent them every antibiotic they had, 15 antibiotics given, everything that was known in the US. None of them worked. She's the first patient to die in the US of an antibiotic resistant strain that nothing at all worked on. And that is what doctors are afraid of. The second to last chapter in the book is called The Coming Pandemic. I don't mention in the book the word COVID because COVID had not broken out by the time I finished writing this. What I was talking about in The Coming Pandemic is what doctors say will be a bacterial-based pandemic because of antibiotic resistance. Since the 1950s, when antibiotics came out, doctors have been overprescribing them. If antibiotics are a good thing, I believe that penicillin was a good development. The idea became in the American medical community, well, if it's a good thing, then let's give more of a good thing out. And they prescribed it for everything. They gave it out for things it should never have been prescribed for. Many of the conditions for which they prescribed them, from the sniffles to a sore throat to wherever, were minor viruses that people would have naturally recovered from. Instead, they gave them antibiotics when they didn't need them, and people started to develop resistance to it. They've done that over time. Couple that with the fact that in 1980, there were 36 companies in the United States developing or researching antibiotics. Today, there are none. And that's because they've all left the field of antibiotic research. It's all abroad now, basically in China and India, because there's not enough money in it. They've looked for more profitable drugs in chronic diseases that people have to take pills every day. So we have a combination of fewer companies doing new antibiotic research, with antibiotic resistance growing because it's used in the food supply and in agriculture. And as a result, there will come the moment at which human nature teaches us a lesson. It will finally come up with a pathogen, a superbug that already kills tens of thousands of people a year, a bacteria that is immune to all the antibiotics on the planet. And at that point, we'll be scrambling for something to be able to fight this pathogen from spreading from one person to another. It's not here now. I don't mean that to sound like gloom and doom. Nobody during the middle of COVID needs to hear somebody say, oh, you think COVID's bad, wait for the bacterial pathogen antibiotic plague. I'm just saying that we have put ourselves into a situation as humans, in part because of the fault of the drug companies, to create a drug that we've become largely resistant to because we've overused it in so many different areas. And now we're complaining about the fact that that resistance is out there, but none of the drug companies are doing anything to try to come up with a drug that might fight it because there's not enough money in it. That's madness.
What's been the response from the government and the FDA to your book?
I have had private conversations with some of the doctors and researchers still involved in government work that were of assistance when I was doing the research on this book. And privately, they will tell me that they really liked it. They learned, everybody, if somebody's an immunologist, they learned something about the opioid trade they never knew. If somebody's involved in infectious diseases, they found out something in the history of what happened with patent drugs they knew nothing about. There's something for everybody here, so they've enjoyed it. But they don't say that publicly because it's a hard book on the pharmaceutical industry, and it's very critical. So there are private, yes, I enjoyed it, good work, but publicly, I haven't had anybody stand up and say, that's on my bookshelf.
Are the Republicans or the Democrats more likely to be pro-pharmaceutical industry?
So, this is so interesting because I view this book as not a political book. And the reason it's not a political book is because both sides of the aisles at different times have been in the pocket of the pharmaceutical company. Yes, you pick a period of time, and I'll tell you which party is to blame at that particular period. So there are many times when I say the Republicans are to blame here. They did this on the FDA in the 90s, and the Democrats less so, but the Democrats have done it plenty of times. They've given in the pharmaceutical industry, provide a lot of money into PACs and political funding and campaigns. And as a result, I find that both political parties have been beholden to them too many times, and that's a shame. So in the best example of this, in the beginning of COVID, in March of last year, when COVID first started to break, there was the first of what I call the emergency spending bills, before stimulus, before taxpayers started to get money. It was $8 billion. $3 billion was going into funding of vaccine research. So we were throwing the money into drug companies to say, come up with a vaccine. The first draft of that bill said that the money being given by the federal government could be used by these companies if they shared the research. So nobody would own the intellectual property rights to it. It would have to be shared. You're making progress at Pfizer. You'd have to share it with Johnson & Johnson, who would share it with Moderna. They'd all be working together to use that money to come up with a vaccine that worked. And secondly, it would have to be fairly priced. And if it wasn't, the government had some mechanism to come in and really lower the price. And guess what? By the time that bill was passed, 2 weeks after it was first introduced, both of those were out. So the companies were allowed to take the money and keep the proprietary rights to sell their own products. They didn't have to share it. And there was nothing about what the profit was built in. Democrats and Republicans passed that bill. It was passed unanimously. So you say which party's to blame? They could have held the feet to the fire. They didn't at that time. And that's really unfortunate. We had a Democratic House. We had a Republican Senate. Nobody in the end stood up and said, we have to have those in. They just threw the money at the drug industry. And that's unfortunate.
Why was it important for you to come here and speak at the Real Truth About Health conference?
I don't think there's anything more important than informed consumers. Informed consumers being patients. You have to, I know this from my wife Trisha's own book about menopause. She says in there, when her doctor, her gynecologist tells her you have to take hormone replacement therapy. And she leaves there and does some research. And guess what? Decides it's not for her because of the history of breast cancer in her family. And so she takes a route with natural medications and herbs and supplements and exercise. It works for her. And that would never have happened if she hadn't questioned the advice from her doctor and then done a little bit of research. You need to do that research. And that's what conferences, especially like this, can do. It allows the public and people already interested to come in and hear a variety of ideas. It doesn't mean that everybody you listen to, you're going to agree with. There are people that will disagree with me about the fact there are people that think that no pharmaceutical drug is good. There are people that think that I'm not hard enough on the drug industry. People think I'm too hard on the drug industry. But you take the information that I give, take the information from other panelists, and you distill it. There's nobody that has the absolute truth. They give you bits of information that then becomes something for you to utilize yourself. And this is what happens over this 10-day period. You get flooded with information. You get to follow a whole bunch of new things that you didn't know about before, and you become an educated consumer who doesn't become a victim for the drug industry's advertisements, that you're going to listen to something and go out and follow it blindly. Make sure that if you do decide to take a pill and a doctor's prescribed it, that you're convinced it's absolutely necessary and needed. You can do that. Or is there an alternative? Is there another way of treatment that you might be able to do it naturally? Become that consumer, become that patient, and you'll be better off for it in the long term. That's why this is so important to be part of.
Well, with that, we thank you very much for being a part of it and for all of your time today, as well as all of your very, very meaningful work. Very much appreciated.
No, thank you so much for having me. I was looking forward to this, and I'm glad we're able to do it. I'm looking forward to April as well.
That's wonderful. Again, thanks very much, Joe. Appreciate it.
Thanks. I hope it's good, and hope that's of some use. Sometimes, as you can tell, I'm still passionate about this. There are things that get me still angry. No matter how much I talk about it. It seems like common sense to me, but what do I know?
We see you as a hero, and we appreciate it. And that goes for Trish as well. So thank you both very much.
Thanks, Trish, for those reminders. All right. Talk to you later. Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.